George William Friedrich Hegel, the great defender of German idealism, has a reputation for being one of the hardest philosophers to understand in the entire history of philosophy. But at the end of the 19th century, there was a philosopher who claimed to have understood him perfectly by following a surprising method, one that, I'm sorry to say, no matter how eager you are to tame this titan of philosophy, I do not recommend at all. But who was this wise philosopher and how did he pull off such a feat? That's what we will be talking about in today's video. I'm Enric, welcome back to Addicted to Philosophy, let's get started. Let me introduce you to William James, a versatile thinker working at the crossroads of physiology, psychology and philosophy. Born in New York on January 11, 1842, his life was marked by recurring periods of depression and generally poor health. Intellectually, he was one of the earliest defenders of neutral monism, the idea later taken up by Bertrand Russell that the foundation of reality is neither material nor mental. He was also one of the main exponents of pragmatism, the idea that truth, or the value of truth, lies in its usefulness, in its ability to help us socially or individually improve our life in some way. James lived in a curious moment in Anglo-American philosophy. At the end of the 19th century, Hegelism suddenly became fashionable, very fashionable, in universities across England and the United States. Something rather unexpected in what was supposed to be an analytic world, given that Hegel was a continental philosopher. This is what James writes in 1882. We are just now witnessing a singular phenomenon in British and American philosophy. Hegelianism, so defunct on its native soil, has found among us so zealous and able a set of propagandists that today it may really be reckoned one of the most powerful influences of the time in the higher walks of thought. This created in William James an urgent need to understand Hegelian philosophy in depth, so that he could dismantle it if necessary. And that's what led him to try the surprising method I mentioned at the beginning. But first, we need to understand a bit more about what this Hegelian philosophical system actually consisted of, and why it worried William James so much. Hegel's philosophy is known as absolute idealism, and it held that all the changing reality we experience through the senses is the result of the self-manifestation and self-development of a universal spirit or consciousness that, by coming to know itself, unfolds throughout the history of the cosmos and of humanity. For Hegel, the driving force of this process was contradiction. It is the dynamic between something and its negation that pushes the spirit to move, to escape contradiction, and to progress towards a synthesis that ultimately absorbs everything into a perfect unity.
Oh my god.
As I said at the beginning, Hegel's system and thought are extremely complex, and it's impossible to do them justice with a simplification like this, and it didn't help at all that the guy wrote, well,
Like crap.
I was going to say in German.
Isn't that the same thing?
James, in fact, strongly criticizes what he saw as a kind of Hegelian obscurantism, accusing it of hiding contradictions behind a mist of mystification and of baptizing young people into what he called the faith of confusion. We'll soon see the very unorthodox way he managed to cut through what he saw as unnecessary obfuscations in order to grasp both the true core and the errors of Hegelian thought. But first, we need to understand that James didn't necessarily have a problem with the idealist dimension of Hegel's proposal, that is, with the claim that mind or consciousness might ultimately underlie everything. I have not myself the least objection to idealism, he writes, and hypotheses which voluminous considerations make plausible and whose difficulties may be cleared away any day by new discriminations or discoveries. His main problem rather lies with the absolutist pretension of Hegelian thought. Hegel was breaking into philosophy departments with such force that for many he was starting to become a kind of dogma, the absolute, unquestionable final truth, the only genuinely possible philosophy, with all others reduced to pseudo-philosophies. James saw in this an intellectual arrogance unworthy of a philosopher. For him, the most a philosophy can ever aspire to is to be a plausible, reasonable, legitimate hypothesis, and nothing more than that. When a philosophy hides its status as a hypothesis, as one rational option among others, and instead adopts the dogmatic pretension of being identical to reason itself, it abandons the path of philosophy and falls into the worst vices of religion. And that, in his eyes, is exactly what was happening with Hegelian idealism. What hope is there of squaring and settling opinions unless Hegelian absolutism will hold parley on this common ground, and will admit that all philosophies are hypotheses, to which all our faculties, emotional as well as logical, help us? This, then, is the main problem James finds in the new Hegelian fashion. It's absolutism. The claim to be the perfect, final, definitive expression of a truth already settled and therefore no longer open to discussion. If philosophy was already completed by Hegel, then there's no room left to keep thinking or to make any progress. By the way, if you are enjoying this video, give it a big like. It really helps me reach a lot more people. Thank you. Now, James says there is something true in the Hegelian system. Something he finally managed to grasp thanks to a method that was about as unorthodox as it gets: inhaling nitrous oxide.
You are joking, right?
No, I wish, but no, it's real. 100% real, no fake. He tells the story in a short article, also from 1882, titled The Subjective Effects of Nitrous Oxide. With me, the keynote of the experience is the tremendously exciting sense of an intense metaphysical illumination. The center and periphery of things seem to come together. The ego and its objects, the meum and the tuum, are one. Now this, only 1,000-fold enhanced, was the effect upon me of the gas. And its first result was to make peel through me with unutterable power the conviction that Hegelism was true after all, and that the deepest convictions of my intellect hitherto were wrong. But James doesn't quite draw from this the conclusion that Hegel was actually right. In fact, as the effects of the gas wore off, he says that his initial mystical rapture gradually turned into horror, as he realized firsthand that such a revelation inevitably led to a fatalistic pessimism in which everything is completely necessary. In fact, here lies another of James's main criticisms of Hegelianism, at least as he understood it. If everything that happens in history is the unfolding of a fully rational spirit, then the connection between historical events is governed by the same necessity as the steps of a logical inference. But if we make everything that happens necessary, leaving no room for contingency, then moral experience and freedom lose their meaning. If everything must necessarily be exactly as it is, because any alternative would be irrational and the spirit cannot tolerate that, then nothing that happens or fails to happen is really my responsibility. Everything happens because it logically had to happen that way, full stop. And I can't even say that something that happens is wrong, because what is wrong is what should not happen. But for Hegel, at least as James interprets him, nothing can fall outside what is foreseen. Nothing can happen that shouldn't happen. Everything unfolds according to the inner logical development of the spirit, and therefore it happens because it had to happen. So, what James takes away from this double experience, mystical on the one hand and horrifying on the other, is a confirmation of his rejection of Hegelianism. First, he sees more clearly the grain of truth in Hegelian thought and what has drawn so many minds to it. The intuition that, in some sense, all things are one, that there is a unity beneath multiplicity. He also sees that when someone truly experiences this intuition, it generates such a powerful emotion in the human spirit that in people temperamentally disposed to it, it makes sense that it would incline them towards Hegel's characteristic absolutist monism. But at the same time, he comes away even more convinced that Hegelian philosophy, by collapsing the world's plurality and contingency into the absolute monism of a necessary unity, has unacceptable consequences both theoretically and practically. My conclusion is that the togetherness of things in a common world may, when perceived, engender a very powerful emotion. That Hegel was so unusually susceptible to this emotion throughout his life that its gratification became his supreme end. That indifferentism is the true outcome of every view of the world which makes infinity and continuity to be its essence. Finally, that the identification of contradictories, so far from being the self-developing process which Hegel supposes, is really a self-consuming process, passing from the less to the more abstract and terminating either in a laugh at the ultimate nothingness or in a mood of vertiginous amazement at a meaningless infinity. Although James strongly encouraged everyone to repeat this experiment, I don't recommend it. Understanding Hegel just isn't worth it. What I do recommend is continuing to learn about William James's thought, which is fascinating and much easier to understand. For example, did you know that against the common thinking of his time, he argued that the possibility of life after death was still compatible with the scientific evidence about the relationship between mind and brain? But I already told you all about that in this other video right here, so go on, give it a good click so you don't miss it, and above all, don't forget to think.